we have actually a number of people from Cal Poly in our office, and they're really terrific. So we hope we can see more of you in the future. Yeah, today actually I wanted to concentrate on the 3 projects that are either built or in the process of being built. The 014 office tower, which was completed in 2011 in Dubai, and then the Kaohsiung Port Terminal and the Taipei Pop Music Center. Of course I'll be explaining the project, but I'll also at certain moments divert into some little bit of theory around the projects. Typically for us it's not so much a question of trying to produce a theory and then design the building, but that the building really is an occasion not only to speculate, to use it as a speculative vehicle for architecture, but the process of designing should feed back into theory. And so much of what we have written in terms of the atlas and then later work that we did in the 014 publication that the Architectural Association produced has to do with, in a sense, looking at the design process, theorizing some wider set of possibilities, beyond just the project, towards new projects. But again, the theory issue is, something that we think is really important to maintain, while designing buildings, and that we see that as an ongoing and ever-changing set of ideas. So the atlas, in certain sense, has been superseded, or I started to realize some problems with elements of the atlas and try to answer those in the AA publication. And it keeps going. Anyway, let me begin. I think I can just jump right into the 014 project. I guess the first thing one would want to establish with a place like Dubai is just the instantaneity of the city. Everybody knows that, from the beginning, from the development of the port, and then through a whole series of these zones, which are like kind of artificial micro cities, each very monofunctional. They're themed. They were created mainly remotely in terms of their design, and there is, of course, a consequent difficulty in tying these islands of urbanism together. It takes sometimes 3 hours to go from one zone of Dubai to the next. From living, working, and playing are radically separated in this place. And companies like Halcro, a big kind of engineering and design firm in England, are the ones who really, they've been embedded in Dubai for years and have created these very strange master plans. But it really is, a project emerging, almost tabula rasa. There, of course, was a very small settlement and trading area in the downtown of Dubai, but then the rest of it really kind of emerged out of the desert over a relatively short time. But the thing I'd also want to say in terms of the ambitions for the 014 tower relate not so much to the specific site of Dubai, but just the phenomena of these rapidly expanding cities across the Middle East and the Far East and in other places as well. So our argument really is that 014 is not so much a site-specific place. It belongs to a strange new category of urbanism that in a sense crosses the globe. So the hope is that that model, or the way to think through the design of a tower, which is inherently a pretty cosmopolitan kind of structure, could extend beyond just Dubai itself. But this was the master plan that we received as part of a competition invitation. This is Business Bay, yet unbuilt, but having this almost Venice-like master plan extending into Dubai Creek. And we were asked to design a large multi-use office tower containing hotel and offices, a mall, various other elements. So it was an 84-story building. It was supposed to be the central iconic building, and it was to be in the center of that circle, and supplanting the little fountain they may have rendered there. But this is actually the site. We were all taken to the site visit, and that red flag is where the 84-story building was to have been built. And these were our competitors. Ultimately, Zaha Hadid won the competition with the Dancing Towers. Ours was on the image on the right, and there was a young developer who ran the competition for Dubai Properties, who got very interested in our work. Ultimately, they didn't even build the Dancing Towers, but he took us on for his first commission and his first project as a developer to do a 22-story building, so a quarter of the scale. It was at first a mixed-use project to be residential and office, and ultimately became all office. But he was very excited about the kind of formal richness of the 84-story building. He wanted to see that happen in a 22-story building. We went through 16 iterations, none of which really could work, and came to a kind of impasse in terms of trying to produce this sort of miniature of the Eon Tower. And ultimately, we rethought the problem, and it became instead not so much a project about formal complexity. It ultimately was just a kind of soft cruciform extrusion. It was really a matter of really rethinking what the tower could be. And so I'm going to backtrack a little bit. This is Rem Koolhaas's proposal for Dubai Renaissance. This building, of course, connects more back to a modernist idea. Of course, the only thing that was different that we wanted this 84-story tower to rotate, to pirouette. So that was a huge technical challenge which never could be overcome. But I show this slide because it's just very interesting in terms of what his thought about what the new context would be. That he tried to put versions of various of his competitors into the scene, kind of demonstrating this very modernist prism over and against all of the formal calisthenics of, the building on the far left was the United Architects Tower for Ground Zero that we participated in, along with other of our contemporaries. But there's also, I think, a little Talmain and a little Zaha put in there as well. I thought that was a really interesting way of delivering an argument, and then it led to some thoughts about issues of context. Of course, Rem's model comes from Nice. These fantastic, early collages, showing this new modernist prism in the 19th century city. And it's a very interesting kind of progression where, of course, when it's a solitary building, it's an iconic building, simply by the virtue of the fact that it's so new and so singular. But then, of course, as these cities develop, it starts to kind of more and more melt into a background, besides conoscenti who really know Mies, that might be mistaken for just another background building. So we were trying to think through some other way of dealing with this issue of context, and also because it was really a demand, a kind of thematic demand, and I'm going to be talking about this all during the entire lecture, that how to deal with the demand for the iconic in architecture, because it's very much a part of competition briefs, and it's part of what developers want. But there might be other ways of dealing with that kind of issue productively, and not to fall back into kind of cliche tropes of iconicity. So that's very important. And I'm going to go into this by way of a series of avatars, if you will, that might relate to various ways of connecting to context. So the first would be Mies, and you could argue that his avatar would be the Magritte figure, the sort of generic European man, the man without qualities, if you know the Robert Musil book, and to try to produce an architecture, a kind of degree zero architecture that would be the quality without qualities. The second would be the figure of another comic character, Leonard Zelig. This is Woody Allen. You've seen that film. He is the arch sort of comedian. He becomes anything he gets close to. And so, as an example, the use of a kind of a local traditional architecture tied to high tech or tied to some other more kind of modern form. So a kind of an assimilation model. And then the one that we were really fascinated by, which was the Chauncey Gardner model, where you've seen the film with Being There. Peter Sellers is really a very simple gardener. He's making very simple statements, but then everybody reads context into whatever he's saying. So apparently profound statements are actually very simple. He's just talking about gardening. So that has implications when you extend it to architecture. So with the 014 tower, I think because we were using a concrete exoskeleton, there were many readings by ourselves, that we would kind of employ these materially, but then by others as well, which connected to things as kind of diverse as bubbles or cheese. It's called the cheese building in Dubai by the locals. The Russians were convinced that it derives from Melnikov's house, which is not so far off, but we didn't know it at the time if we looked at it. And then of course the other readings as well. So that to us, was fascinating, that there would be at least a diversity of readings that we couldn't or didn't need to control. Just some connection to the Melnikov. And then, it did fulfill its sort of obligation to be iconic. This is a website which sells little souvenirs, and it kind of fits into that thing. But, I think the other part of what we're doing is dealing actually with some very traditional models that could arguably be called the first cosmopolitan models. In other words, minor arts like basket weaving emerge across the world independently, and so they appear to be very connected to a particular place where they're actually fairly global as models, and they resonate in experience when people see the building or look at the reinforcement. Certainly the woven model comes out. Of course, we weren't even looking at traditional basket weaving. We were looking at British bombers. The Wellington bomber uses the geodetic basket weave, and we were thinking through the way of producing this reticulated structure, which ultimately, of course, is enrobed in concrete, but as a kind of basis for organizing the openings in the tower and its openness. So it becomes, in a sense, a matter of exploring the ramifications of these models, like the basket weaving, in a number of ways. On the one side, the sort of material performance and behavior, both in terms of issues like structural redundancy and what that enables you to do, or the sustainability dimension of O14, or on the other hand, its optical qualities, which for architects I think should be very important. How the building looks is not unimportant. What its effects are in the city and in proximity or far away, was a deep concern to us. And I think there's another thing that kind of emerges out of this. Again, this is more interpretation, but that something has happened in the past 15 or 20 years that has shifted our notion of what an iconic building is, or how it kind of presents itself. And I think it gets tied to computation in a way. But it also extends simply to the kind of omnipresence of media, something that we resisted. In other words, it's not so much a subject of our architecture, although many people around us, especially at Princeton, are deeply involved in these kinds of projects, like things called media and modernity. We're much more interested in the kind of direct material issues of architecture, but nevertheless, we realize that the work gets transmitted into the world and is received in various ways. So, one could say that there's a very different picture, say, of the Mona Lisa at the Louvre, that if you see the Mona Lisa in reproduction, it's actually, in many respects, much more impressive than when you actually see this limited artifact, which you realize is old and warped and somehow is limited by its originality, but that once it's reproduced and it's disseminated, it seems to fill the world. It has much more presence and power. This perception is really very much against an old Marxist theorist, Walter Benjamin, who still sort of stakes, it becomes very important to kind of recognize the aura or the power of originals. And so I think that connects to technology as well. And a lot of the effects that flowed out of O14, and I think of other projects, contemporary projects as well, deals with this notion that there really is no original anymore in design. That we're dealing with multiple iterations and versions, and that issue of the unoriginal then begins to extend out into the way the building is perceived as well. That somehow it has a presence, it has a strange kind of effect of a distance, but it's no longer tied to place in the same way. And so that also gets connected to the issue of materiality. There's a recognition, even 20 years ago, when Todd Williams and Billy Chen, designed the Folk Art Museum, that New York, I guess the context of New York, because of the omnipresence of a lot of modernist buildings, that the sense of immediacy and reality was beginning to slip away, and that the honesty of material arguments, say of modernism, were no longer enough to ensure this sense of presence. Hence, they kind of amplified, the cladding of the building. Its materiality is almost beyond the normal scale of materials of cladding. It's made larger, more aggressive, in an attempt to really bring back this sense of authenticity and of place. And on the other side, if you kind of look at a spectrum of ambitions, on the other side of this spectrum, I would argue that a place like the Yas Hotel by Asymptote is attempting to do almost the opposite. That they want their building to become, it's all about material systems. There's nothing immaterial about any of this stuff. But the Asymptote project wants to become light. It wants to become almost a virtual image of a building, especially in all of its kind of nighttime effects. So we sort of find ourselves in between those two poles, I would say, with O14. that at once, we are very interested in the materiality, but it also should kind of, because of the use of a certain kind of abstraction, should always kind of produce this sense of a distance as well. So, that has been, of real importance for us, how to produce those kinds of effects, both in close proximity to the building, but also what its presence would be in the city. And of course, there are all of these sort of tropes for how to produce an iconic building: make it big, make it move, make it red, and so on. We were trying, not to kind of get too connected into any of those, but that's sort of the standard set of expectations that you see, in places like Dubai, where every single building, cheek by jowl, is trying to be iconic in that way. We were really interested in, I guess the kind of derivations of op art into pop, like the Sea of Holes in Yellow Submarine, and also, how one would actually kind of more rigorously work with this field effect, both in kind of close oblique views like that, or also at a distance where you have multiple vanishing points because of the gradient scales of the holes, and what that does to subjectivity, as compared, say, to a perspectival view. And there's also just the material arguments, which harken back even to 19th century explorations, having to do with the sort of transposition arguments about how wooden buildings in classical architecture get converted to stone. In 014, we argue that instead of that kind of transposition, you get a more direct material transmission, that the effect of the spacing of the rebars and that kind of inner basket is transmitted to the enrobement, to the concrete shell outside. So locating 014 in that way, in terms of sort of structure and expression, we're not doing the modernist skin and bones project, nor do we want to go to the kind of overburdened expressionism of structural expressionism, where the building is like an athlete, but that there are, in a way, sort of weaker forms of material expression that are really interesting in terms of what they do. And so I found this image where there's a really interesting kind of superposition. On the one hand, there's the natural body of the woman. On the other hand, through the cosmetic transformation, she connects kind of a surface feature to a material substrate, which is her. And the two are not really in contradiction, but they work together in very strange ways. And so 014, in that sense, both does perform as an exoskeleton. It does work in a fairly straightforward way as a material system. On the other hand, there's enough play in the redundant system that you get these kinds of possibilities happening. That it's not the most efficient structure, in other words, but that redundancy allows you to bring another level of expression into the building. And if you didn't have that, you really wouldn't get much expression at all. So that's a kind of, it was a dilemma for a long time. I've kind of come to terms with it. And this image for me was sort of a proof of concept. The other part of the project, which kind of moves us away from complex form, at least in this project, was the idea that we wouldn't have to do we could do a fairly efficient floor plate using the exoskeleton through a simple extrusion, and that the featuring, in other words, the holes in the exoskeleton of 014, would modify that form sufficiently that you didn't need to overly elaborate the envelope, that it was more in the kind of use of pattern relative to a fairly simple form that something could happen. And that also relates to the way the exoskeleton is used. There's conventionally one would produce a uniform diagrid. It's probably more more optimized. It could be more optimized than the one we had. But it also has certain limitations in terms of how one would perceive the building, because the crossovers in the relationship between the floor slabs and the diagrid, they line up. So you get very uniform connections, very rational kind of system of connections at each floor. And you can also tell very clearly how many floors there are. With 014, we were really trying to defeat that perception, among other things. So we used an out-of-phase diagrid, and we still had connections at these sort of crossover node points, but they became very asymmetrical. We ended up with a fairly wide range of connections back to the floor slabs, and it did produce that effect. In blogs, people were looking at this, where they were trying to match, first of all, our rendering to the building and process, but also trying to figure out how high the building was and where holes were on floors. There was a moment with one of the early contractors taken on board where they asked us to look at reorienting the diagrid vertical horizontal, which actually then didn't make it a shell, didn't give it shell action at all. It became a series of Virendeals, and it also, to us, really defeated the dynamics of the diagonal. So it was very important in 014 to have that diagonal layout of holes, that it really sort of dynamic range of the building tremendously, whereas this gave it a much more stratified appearance. This is an unrolled view of the shell, and there are other issues too of materiality as the building developed from the rendering to the building in process, and that's probably its most clear material state when the concrete was exposed. This was a painted building because the contractor was completely unwilling to use fair-face concrete because he couldn't repair it. So it was most sort of apparent, most material in construction, and then at least in the first weeks of its completion, it had an uncanny relationship to the renderings. So I think that's also a new phenomenon, not just limited to our practice, but as we get into the possibilities of design and fabrication, I think more and more we're going to see these just uncanny resemblances between the 3D models that are produced and then the actual buildings. So yeah, again, as compared to an older modernist tower, you have a very different sort of sense of perspectival effects, multiple versus singular. And that extends again, into the office spaces themselves. That, arguably, projects like Inland Steel dealt with the office technologies and organizations of the time. That there was, an equal demand to store paper and paper filing, and to organize groups, within the grid, and that the envelope sort of mimicked or matched that that way of thinking about work. And this is the famous George Tooker painting that sort of dramatizes that. We were really interested in the kind of long-term possibilities of 014, that it's a spec office tower. Interiors get stripped out, at a fairly rapid rate. The technologies also change, and so the utopian argument we're making for the building, since it's going to outlast its interiors, is that the interiors now are still office landscape. They fit more that older 50s pattern, but as those technologies get lighter and lighter, the effects of the facade are going to actually be different, hopefully. And that there would be new ways of organizing office space and around material conditions, ambient effects, how the envelope projects different conditions into the building as opposed to this kind of insistently gridded system. And then there are also precedents for O14, and we would connect O14 to an argument that was actually made by Colin Rowe in a really beautiful essay called Chicago Frame. The buildings in Chicago and Dubai mainly are coming out of those models. And in Colin Rowe's essay, he talks for a moment about an anti-frame project. It was the St. Mark's Tower by Frank Lloyd Wright. And so thinking about it, even in the kind of organic sense of the architecture, O14 is a kind of inverse of the St. Mark's Tower. His kind of tree and plates, we kind of take the tree and expand it to the periphery, and the plates move inward. But it belongs more to that legacy than, say, the frame building, which is more or less the norm in Dubai. The building changed from a mixed-use version and a frame building early on to an exoskeleton project. So that was a major shift in the way we thought about the building. And here you can just see the kind of typical towers in Dubai and ours. And there were many issues, too, in terms of fabrication and ways we could go with the exoskeleton. I had some really interesting discussions with Dean Nordenson, who's a colleague at Princeton, about the sort of merits of cast in place versus precast. And he argued, like in the work he did with Stephen Hall, that the exoskeleton could be made using moment connections in precast, which I thought, well, I mean, that is nice. You can control the castings very well. It would be much more controllable than what would happen, on site. But on the other hand, what it in effect would do would make everybody think that those were decorative facade panels and that there were columns in the building. So we actually went, away from that. And it also clarified for me how maybe the engineers look at performance versus architects. For Guy, I believe, both were exoskeletons and both performed equally well. But from an architectural standpoint, there's a vast difference between the two ways of moving. So this is an animation notionally showing how columns at first would extend out to become an exoskeleton, and then it would be a column-free space with a very light core. Because the building basically has its structure all pulled to the outside, the core could be kept relatively light. And this is just a view between exoskeleton and window wall. All the windows are back a meter for window washing. You can see the neighboring building. And it also, as a byproduct, produced this gap zone between the enclosure, the glazing enclosure, which was a meter back, and then the exoskeleton, and then that allowed for passive cooling, which one of the mechanical engineers said could reach an efficiency of 30% reduction. I'm not sure if that ever was really reached, but it definitely induces that kind of air movement and does reduce cooling costs. So to kind of put the project in an overall trajectory, we've been working at various scales with these kinds of holy projects, using that kind of organizational models in various ways with various effects for a long time. The incarnation of that idea after O14 went to Shenzhen Airport, where you could crudely say that the exoskeleton shell was turned on its side, became a vault, and we sort of upped the kind of effects ante by looking not just at perpendicular punches, but of varying the cross-sectional condition of the punch. So the outside, the argument was here that there was actually going to be a cladding system and a glazing system on the outside of that wall. That had to be totally uniform for economy. But then, past that point, the section of the whole could change, and that one could regulate light and produce a lot of different atmospheric effects in the space through changing the cross section. We also have then moved to another proposal that I can't talk too much about in Mexico for a 64-story tower, which utilizes some of the ideas that were developed both in 014 but then in Shenzhen, so it went back vertical again. I'll run very quickly through some of the construction shots. We used waste molds. These were using automated foam cutting by a company in China. They set up on site and took our digital files and cut all of the holes. And this is one of the early shots in construction where the shuttering or the formwork gets slipped up. But there were real challenges. It was a real learning curve and how to do this kind of work. It took, I think, something like 2.5 weeks to do the first levels. And then they got it down, I think at best, it was never the fastest, but I think they got it down to about 1.5 weeks per level as they kind of learned how to deal with locating the void forms and doing more standardized reinforcement. Again, I think that's part of what's happening today. You have really optimized directives and drawing sets, that we had, our engineers generated many different types of reinforcement densities as the tower went up, which would follow the logic of the tower, but in practice the contractor would prefer more standardized ways of dealing with it. So past the second level, I think the building was actually over-reinforced. They just kept going with it because it was faster. So these, relate to the kind of the intersection of these sorts of technologies with local building culture. Might use. The building is, very well set up to explore lighting effects because of that 1 meter gap between the window wall system, which was incidentally a very inexpensive system. We didn't put too much, that all of the energy and expense was really directed at the exoskeleton. And then we could have relatively simple window wall systems in behind it. It also eliminated the problem of tolerances here because the first iterations of the building did have glazing in the holes, but then they could never guarantee to us that the tolerances wouldn't be too huge. You get these huge gaps and between the standard glazing and then the edge of the concrete. So we finally separated those two systems. Here's where the exoskeleton emerges at the roof level. And there were a whole series, there was a podium as well, a 2-level podium, which then connected through the whole system and into the window wall system beyond, so that one could communicate from one level to the next. And then this is a view in the lobby space. There were really interesting issues about dealing with the codes in the master plan, that there was a demand for arcade space. So we argued successfully that we could produce the arcade by offsetting the exoskeleton, not producing a standard base middle top building with applied arcades. So the project is also a kind of gateway building that we, super elevated the podium, higher than the Lever House podium, and it provides a kind of way from the back street to a waterfront esplanade. So it was important to see the building also as a kind of gateway, within a fairly opaque block. And then the reception desk, which took a ridiculous amount of time to design. I mean, that is one of the ironies too, that it isn't a function of scale at all. It took almost as long to do the exoskeletons to kind of get through this piece of furniture, be warned. But this is a view from the podium, the regular building, back into the tower section, looking at those bridges. And then a view out of the podium towards Dubai Creek. So there's a kind of hanging soffit here where we did that, and then the tenants would be responsible for the ceiling and the floor installation. And this was like one of the most recent pictures taken. So the city is actually growing up around 014. It's really changing its status relative to context now. Okay, so I'll move on to our project that broke ground earlier in the summer, the Taipei Pop Music Center. It's really, first and foremost, an urban planning project before it's an architectural project. It kind of combines the two. It was developed over the past 10 years, actually, by the government in Taipei, but also the music industry. And so the competitors were fairly latecomers to the process of thinking through what this new zone of the city should be. It was really, as I said, an urban planning idea first, that a new precinct in Taipei would be developed, devoted to the production and the performance of pop music, as well as sort of a memorial and a hall of fame. So we thought of this as a kind of archipelago of urbanism, that when you moved into this zone of the city, it would be really different from the rest of the context. While that was important for the music industry and for the identity of the complex, we also worked through issues of the scale of this complex relative to the urban fabric, using a lot of the models like the kind of ubiquitous arcades in Dubai for commercial space, but giving them a new morphology relative to the project. So on the one hand, trying to connect into the project at the sort of base level, at the street level, but at the same time trying to give those things a new identity and a new form. And then the issue of the iconic comes up most clearly in the object buildings that we proposed for the project, the main hall, the Hall of Fame, and the Industry Cube. But again, it was really important to see this complex not only in terms of embodied visiting, of going to the place, but also how it would be seen in media, how it would be projected to the world was very important to the pop music industry. But that it would also function on an everyday level for the people who lived there. So two competing demands really, which we had to come to terms with in the project. And the project really changed from the competition brief to the competition, our first iteration, and then the final state of the complex. We were also asked to develop scenarios for the use of the complex, that it be a vital place for 24 hours and not like a stadium where you would have a large influx of people and that dead space in the city between events. So it was about producing this sort of mixed-use urbanism. But anyway, these are the iconic elements, which we defined as in the Hall of Fame. It sat above, this cube sits above the more formed groundwork and urban fabric, the main hall, and then the industry shell. And they have very different geometries and characteristics. And the idea that those things would really be object-like and set away from the kind of low-level fabric. And our clients gave them names. I mean, aside from the cube, which everybody knows, they were assigned names in terms of their identity. We just produced the geometry, they gave the names, and then they also associated their pop icons to the objects. So I think that's another way of working with meaning here, that we weren't going to, as architects, over-determine the local meanings. The meanings could be projected like the earlier argument about Chauncey Gardner. I mean, it's not just an ironic thing, but that those things should happen. So the traditional musicians and producers got it connected to the cube. This is a view down the main way of the cube of Hall of Fame, the main hall, and so forth. Then other kind of middle generation people with the crystal. And there was a big outdoor amphitheater space as well. And then the Green Mountain got another generation of artists associated. So it's really, about connecting two very different sites in the city, a very long and narrow one, which was supposed, that long and narrow site was supposed to have and will have a large outdoor venue for 8,000 people. And then to think through in every particular building the issue of how to integrate infrastructure and architecture together. The bridges that cross the road actually become coextensive with the balconies and the levels in the main theater. So it's about a kind of compound building, each with its own sort of articulation. Then there's an exterior shell which has its architecture, and an interior crystal that has its architecture. And all three of these are brought together in the main hall. So that's the underside of the bridge, at the lowest level of the project. And then from the bridge level and from the outside, this is the Hall of Fame cube, which has an important feature on the facade. It's a staircase that connects all of the levels of the Hall of Fame and its museum and gallery and library and retrieval functions. And that stair then gets connected to a kind of timeline for Taiwanese pop and how a number of trajectories historically come together and split. So it becomes part of the display function of the Hall of Fame, that everybody has to take that stair to go to all the functions of the building, always return to that facade. So quickly going through the programs, and it contains ticketing and lecture hall at the lowest level, then a large exhibition space that extends beyond the cube for Hall of Fame, smaller exhibition galleries, more multifunctional and experimental spaces for events, a mediatheque, more exhibition in the library. So it's really a kind of a very complete historical accounting, but also event and display place. The overall master plan was important in terms of weaving people kind of axially through the site to be able to go in and visit all of the functions through a park. And this is the kind of open courtyard where there's a large outdoor venue at night. And we worked extensively with, of course, computer models, but also in our office, a lot of physical models making still happens because we don't trust what happens in the perspective windows of the computer screen. So we always insist on the physical kind of artifacts and the making and scale drawings to really get what we want. Otherwise, you're in for rude shocks. And we were experimenting with finishes too, a kind of flip paint color that's used on automobiles. We'll see if we get that. Okay, we'll show a short video.
Taiwan's pop music is now set to ascend the world stage.
So this was the kind of public relations film for
a veritable city
opening
devoted to pop will soon rise. In addition to its striking architecture, the Taipei Pop Music Center will become a celebrated destination and an instantly recognizable icon. The TPMC heralds a new form of city making, using park and building. Since this site is about public movement and interaction, the sculptural urban fabric moves people through a series of open spaces that combine recreation with pop music performance. The dynamic morphology of the arcades and the sweeping form of the urban fabric acts as an artificial, elevated ground on which the three iconic object buildings of the complex rest: the Hall of Fame, the Industry Shell, and the main hall. The history and triumphs of Taiwan's pop music culture are celebrated in the Cube, home of the Hall of Fame, the Museum of Pop, Research and Lecture. An illuminated staircase in the facade of the Cube is both the primary circulation for visitors and a temporal map. A branching media wall charts the history of Taiwanese pop and its growing significance. This flexible outdoor space provides places to shop, stroll, and dine, and can seamlessly transform into a spectacular outdoor performance venue for 3,000 people. The Industry Shell brings together production, performance, and leisure under one roof. Within the Crystal Egg, state-of-the-art recording and practice studios will allow the industry to showcase and promote new artists at the live houses. Sculptural urban fabric transforms into a pedestrian bridge, connecting the Park Hall of Fame and the Industry Shell to the main hall. This faceted fan-shaped building, with a seating capacity of 5,000, allows for internationally recognized artists to perform in this city of pop, both to live and broadcast audiences. Above all, the Taipei Pop Music Center will become a new creative district in the city, with a unique identity, style, and aesthetic. It will be an international attraction for fans of all ages, and promises to immerse visitors in the spirit of innovation, unique to Taiwanese pop.